too. I spent the night in Port Fairy and drove on the next day to the Mornington Peninsula along the Great Ocean Road, a tortuous, spectacularly scenic coastal highway built after World War I as a make-work scheme for veterans. It took 14 years to construct, and you can see why at once, because for most of its 187 miles, it swoops along an impossibly challenging coastline in a hair-raising manner, barreling around rocky headlands and clinging to the edge of sheer and crumbly cliffs. So demanding of attention are the endless hairpin bends that you scarcely have a moment to notice the views, but I figured an occasional glimpsed view was better than none. Here and there in the water stand pinnacles of rock created by the tireless, erosive might of the sea. There used to be a natural rock arc called London Bridge over which you could stroll to stand above the sea, but in 1990 it collapsed, sending tons of debris into the surf below and stranding two startled but miraculously unharmed tourists on the seaward stub. London Bridge is now London Stacks. The drive was as gorgeous as the guidebooks had promised. On one side, the steep, wooded, semi-tropical hills of the Otway Ranges, plunging straight into the sea. On the other, foamy surf rolling onto the long, curving beaches, framed at either end by rocky outcrops. This stretch of Victorian coast is famous for two things: surfing and shipwrecks. With its wild currents and famous fogs, the South Victorian coast was long notorious to mariners. If you took all the water away, you would see 1,200 ships lying broken on the seabed, more than almost anywhere else in the world. I stopped from time to time to get out and take in the view. It really was the only way for a solitary driver to see them, and poked about in one or two of the sweetly old-fashioned little resort communities that lay along the way. These were surprisingly quiet, considering that it was the height of the Australian summer and the day after a national holiday. It struck me, not for the first time, that there seemed to be more places in Australia for tourists to go than there were tourists to fill them. At a place called Torquay, the Great Ocean Road rejoined the main highway toward Melbourne. 20 miles to the west, I noticed, was Winchelsea, where Thomas Austin set free the 24 rabbits that transformed the Australian landscape. The countryside round about looked vaguely arid and unpromising. It reminded me of Oklahoma or western Kansas, but I had no way of knowing, of course, how much of this could be attributed to the voracity of rabbits. Now you would think that people might have learned a lesson from Austin's experience, but amazingly no. At the very moment that rabbits were eating their way across the countryside, influential people were introducing other species of animals in great numbers, sometimes for sport, sometimes by accident, but mostly in an effort to liven things up a little. Precisely the same impulse that led people to build English-style parks in places like Adelaide led them to try to manipulate the countryside as well. Australia was deemed biologically deficient, its semi-arid plains too monotonous, its forests too silent. Gradually, their across acclimatizations societies that made scores of eager introductions to fulfill a longing for the familiar. Before long, it occurred to the societies that there was no reason to stop with British or even European animals. They began to dream of creating an African veld in Australia with giraffes, springboks, and buffaloes grazing the sunny plains. Their aspirations took on an almost surreal quality. In 1862, Sir Henry Berkeley, Governor of Victoria, called for the introduction of monkeys into the colony's forests for the amusement of wayfarers whom their gambols would delight. Before this could be acted on, Berkeley had been replaced by Sir Charles Darling, who said he didn't want monkeys but would be very pleased to see boa constrictors. He didn't get his way either, but scores of others did. Acclimatization was one of the most foolish and dangerous ideas ever to infect the thinking of 19th century men, writes Tim Lowe in the improbably gripping Feral Future, the untold story of Australia's exotic invaders, but infect them it did. Victoria, for some reason, became the hotbed of all this. Despite the experience with rabbits, dozens of other foolish introductions were made. In the 1860s, the Ballarat Acclimatization Society loosed foxes into the landscape, and they quickly became a scourge, a position from which they have not yet retreated. Other animals escaped or were abandoned and went wild. Camels were used to build the railroad from Adelaide to Alice Springs, but were set free when the work was completed. Today, 100,000 of them roam the central and western deserts, the only place in the world where one-humped dromedaries exist in the wild. Across the country, there are up to 5 million wild donkeys, 1 million or more wild horses called brumbies, and large numbers of water buffaloes, cows, goats, sheep, pigs, foxes, and dogs. Feral pigs have been caught in Melbourne suburbs. There are so many introduced species, in fact, that the once mighty red kangaroo is now only the 13th largest animal in the country. The consequences for native species have often been devastating. About 130 mammals in Australia are threatened. 16 have gone extinct, more than in any other continent. And guess what is the mightiest killer of all? According to the National Parks and Wildlife Service, it is a common cat. Cats love the Australian wild. There are 12 million of them out there, inhabiting every niche in the landscape, from the driest deserts to the tallest mountains. With the fox, they have driven many of Australia's smallest, cutest, and most vulnerable native animals to the edge of extinction. Numbats, bettongs, foals, potoroos, bandicoots, rock wallabies, platypuses, and many others. Since most of these creatures are nocturnal and rarely seen, most people don't notice their absence, but they are going fast. As with animals, so with plants. In the 1860s, Victoria was unfortunate to have as chief botanist a dedicated acclimatizer with the imposing name of Baron Ferdinando Jacob Heinrich von Müller. As with animal acclimatizers, von Müller couldn't abide what he viewed as the impoverished nature of Australia's flora, and he spent much of his free time traveling the country sowing seeds of pumpkins, cabbages, melons, and whatever else he thought might flourish. He had a special affection for blackberries, planting clumps of them all over. The blackberry is now Victoria's most pernicious weed, all but ineradicable and the bane of farmers everywhere. Where unmolested, it takes over whole landscapes. I saw some now as I drove along. The lesson in this, that exotic species often thrive in Australia in a way that staggers belief, is one that Australians have had a curiously hard time fully grasping. Prickly pear, a type of pulpy cactus native to America, was introduced in Queensland early in this century as a potential stock feed and quickly went crazy. By 1925, 30 million acres were overrun with impenetrable groves of prickly pear up to 6 feet high. It is an almost absurdly dense plant. An acre of prickly pear weighs 800 tons, as against about 15 tons for an acre of wheat, and a nightmare to clear. For a while it looked as if much of Queensland and beyond would simply become one Europe-sized bed of prickly pear. Fortunately, it could be treated effectively with pesticides, and the moth, whose larvae relishes its leaves, but it was a close-run thing, and the cost was substantial. Altogether, according to law, Australia is now home to more than 2,700 foreign weeds. Interestingly, botanical gardens are among the worst offenders. 3 escaped from Darwin's Botanic Gardens: mimosa bush, leucaena, and crutch tree threaten Kudu National Park, a World Heritage Site, and there have been others elsewhere. Where these things come from is often a mystery. According to law, in recent years, a biting ant from the genus Iridomyrmex has infested Brisbane. It has become a common nuisance. Interestingly, no one knows where it came from or how it got there. It just one day appeared. Nor, for obvious reason, can anyone say where it will spread or what quiet havoc it might wreak. One thing alone is certain: as so often, it appears to be doing better in Australia than wherever it came from. The Mornington Peninsula is a spar of land just south of Melbourne. It is, I suppose, Victoria's Cape Cod, in that it is coastal and very pretty and crowded with summer homes. It even has something of the same shape curling around in a scorpion tail that almost encloses the considerable immensity of Port Phillip Bay, across which, at a distance of some 50 miles, stands Melbourne. I had two particular reasons for wanting to be here. Kathleen Veitch had made it sound so appealing in her letters, and it was here that Australia's tragically submersible Prime Minister Harold Holt went for his final swim. Holt's fateful dip was at Portsea, at the peninsula's far end, so it was there I directed myself the next morning after overnighting in the little town of Mornington, though I set off in watery sunshine of the sort that seemed to promise a fine day later on. Portsea was settled under a heavy sea mist, and the temperature when I stepped out of the car was cooler than it had been 20 miles up the road. Most of the few people out in Portsea I noticed were wearing cotton sweaters or jackets.